Today's story is called The Yellow Wallpaper. It has been posted to Slack, and today's slideshow slash criticism slash lens is sociological. Now, sociological, if you'll notice there, contains the root word for society, and so that's essentially what sociological criticism deals with. We are taking a look at societies as they connect to art. So it could be the society that the writer was living in at the time he or she was writing his or her book, or it could be the society that he or she created within his or her book. And then lastly, we'll finish with a couple different sort of societal aspects that can be reflected within literature. Okay, so without further ado, I learned yesterday that these videos need to be less than 15 minutes if they're going to upload to YouTube. So I'm going to go fairly quickly, but I still want to explain things, so I'll try to strike a balance there. But again, you can just pause my boring, droning drivel whenever you need to. So I won't be offended. Here we go. First up, we have historical criticism. So sociological criticism is like the psychological criticism in that it has a bunch of subcategories. Yesterday's moral one didn't really, but this sociological criticism is kind of an umbrella term for a bunch of different criticisms. So first up, we have historical. And historical criticism deals with researching the time and place in which the story was written. So you're taking a look at the conditions in which the author was living and working when writing the book that you're looking at. So if you were to consider 1984 was written in the 1940s, published in 1948, I believe, or thereabouts, and obviously the big thing that was going on in the mid to late 1940s, early to mid 1940s rather, was World War II. And so if you consider George Orwell writing 1984 in the environment of World War II, it helps you kind of understand the book a little better. I think it's fairly obvious how World War II and the Nazi regime kind of informed and influenced Orwell's writing. So you consider questions like what societal expectations and pressures were working on the author. So, many British citizens faced a lack of freedom during wartime, a lack of food, things were rationed. All these sort of societal pressures definitely made their way into and influenced how Orwell wrote the book. So that's what historical criticism does. Additionally, perhaps there are social problems or concerns of the period that are addressed in the book directly. Perhaps there are social problems or concerns or societal issues of the period that we can see working indirectly in the novel. So perhaps the novel is not. So let's say you have a novel set in the American South in the kind of the Bible Belt, and you have an author writing in the American South in the 1990s, let's say, and you have a character in the book that is dealing with perhaps societal pressure around racism, or perhaps getting an abortion or something like that. However, that does not make up the entire plot of the book. That is not what the book focuses on. So that could be an example of a societal issue working indirectly in the novel. So it's not the focus of the novel, but it's present nonetheless. Just dropped my squishy that I'm squishing here. Okay, that's historical criticism. Moving on, we have next up microcosm criticism. And microcosm criticism is where you ignore the time and place in which the novel was written, as it says there, and instead look at the internal society created in the book. So authors, when they write a book or a story, create a society. Sometimes science fiction authors create worlds or universes, but at the very least, a book will create a society. And that's what you want to look at when you're doing microcosm criticism. So we can take a look at that sort of self-contained society and consider what it could possibly teach us about an issue facing our own society. So we can see how the characters deal with issues in that society, and perhaps they do it really well, perhaps they do it really poorly, but we can, like we do with all literature, kind of reflect it back on ourselves and our own societies and consider whether there's any lessons to be learned there. Does it reveal an unacknowledged social structure? So social structures are, structures within society, generally not sort of official structures. We're not talking about kings and queens and official hierarchies like that. We're talking more about sort of unofficial, unspoken ones. The biggest one of which I can think of right now would be class. We're going to take a look at class a little more specifically later on the slideshow. But the class system is a good unacknowledged social structure. Similarly, does it suggest an alternative social pattern? So can it tell us anything about the way our society is organized, and perhaps suggest something different or something new for our society? And lastly, if you're going to do microcosm criticism, what you can do is, if the novel is set in a particular historical period, let's say World War II, 1940s Britain, let's say, then to do some microcosm criticism, you could pick some details out of the book and then do some research to find out how accurately the author depicted that era of history. Oftentimes, it can be revealing if an author perhaps left out certain aspects or perhaps embellished others. That can be revealing as to the author's goals or his or her sort of point in writing the book. Can be revealed by looking at by comparing actual history to the historical depiction in the novel. Okay, that's microcosm criticism. Next up, we have Marxist criticism. Marxist criticism deals with and stems from a gentleman named Karl Marx and Max Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848. Now, communism is a form of government, and it is awfully interesting that we are looking at this, today at this time when a lot of hyper-capitalist societies like the United States are having a lot of trouble dealing with the COVID-19 outbreak. Communism is a theory of government that suggests that the government should be responsible for absolutely everything. And the goal of Marxism was to make everybody equal. So, of course, this Marxist idea, this communist idea, really was quite popular in the early 1900s, early to mid 1900s. A lot of Eastern Europe tried it, and almost all of the communist countries in the world have failed and reverted to or changed to at least some form of capitalism. The only sort of true communist countries really left would be probably North Korea and maybe Cuba, although Cuba has a bit of a capitalist tourism industry. However, the world largely turned away from communism in favor of capitalism. So, communism and Marxism sort of bases its assumptions on producing things, producing goods. Specifically, in capitalism, the private sector would produce things. That's what we have. We have private companies that produce goods that we pay money for. And in Marxism, it would be the government that does that. So Karl Marx and Friedrich, I think I called him Max. It's Friedrich Engels. Communist Manifesto assumes that society is obsessed with materialism, with having things, and it's hard to argue that they're super far off with that. Marx and Engels did not like capitalism because they felt it relied on the exploitation of the worker. Another point that is difficult to argue when you consider that companies, if you think about huge companies like Apple or Nike, their products are made by workers who get paid very little money, and their products that they help to make are sold for a lot of money, with the majority of that money going to executives and not the actual workers. So Marx and Engels felt that the worker was important because without the worker, the product could not be manufactured, and the worker gets exploited for his or her labor and is not properly compensated. Again, hard to argue, given if you take a look at certain corporate relationships between worker and executive in terms of pay. Some of the CEOs' pay grades are obscene. The other thing Marxism identified is that in order for capitalism, which is our form of government, or our form of society rather, I suppose, in order for capitalism to survive, we have to have a strong class division. That means we have to have rich people, and we have to have poor people, and we have to have people in the middle. Otherwise, capitalism will not work. Okay, so how to do Marxist criticism? If you're looking at a story and you are looking at it from a Marxist perspective, you are going to look for some form of controlling class which dictates everything. So if we want to connect this to 1984, and those of you who have read it, I'm hoping that's everyone, bells should be ringing right now, because you have the party in 1984, which does exactly that, controls everything, dictates everything in society. You can look for the working class in the novel or story getting more and more alienated. So in 1984, we have Winston, who is working class. He's kind of outer party. He's not a prole, but he's definitely not in the inner party. And he is getting more alienated or distanced or removed from his work of changing, his work at the Ministry of Truth. So he obviously is getting more alienated, and he obviously begins to resent the society and his position in it. Okay, next up we have a literal or symbolic revolution. So by a working class. So one of the things that Marx and Engels discussed was that if the workers in a factory, we'll just take any sort of generic factory, if the workers in a factory felt like it, they could easily unite and overthrow the management and the owners of that factory, and presumably be able to run it themselves just as well, and be able to share more of the profits for that. So if you're reading a book and you have either a literal revolution or a symbolic one, that leads to a sort of utopian, equitable, equal sharing of resources and profits, then that's a pretty big Marxist tell.